10.1 Introduction. One of the important branches or subfields of psychology is correctional psychology. In this, basic psychological principles and techniques are applied to help the justice system to classify the various mental health problems of prisoners, treatment of the illnesses, and managing the incarcerated and the accused individuals in such a manner that the risk of their repeating the crime gets reduced and thereby improve the safety and security of the general public. Correctional psychology can be explained as a branch of psychology in which the principles of psychology are applied to in the context of justice system in order to classify, treat and manage offenders and to decrease the risk to public safety and to bring about an improvement in the public safety. While there appears no specific training for correctional psychologists, it is said that any psychologist, whether counseling or clinical, developmental or social or cognitive, community psychologists can take up and handle correctional psychology-related issues. By and large, correctional psychologists are involved in post-adjudication such as taking up research projects along with psychological effects of prison on the inmates, as well as probation conditions. They also take up cases for treatment of certain disorders, and provide assessment services. In the present unit, we will explain the concept of correctional psychology and discuss the role of forensic psychologist in prisons, court/trials, interrogation and confession, and describe the role of forensic psychologist in death penalty, trials and appeals, sexual harassment and discrimination, and dealing with persons in conflict with law. 10.2 Correctional psychology, an introduction. Correctional psychology is a subsystem of forensic psychology, and a correctional psychologist is involved in the legal system and deal with mentally ill persons in the prisons and other correctional institutions. It is applied to law, in order to resolve legal, contractual and administrative matters. It is applied to the justice system to inform the classification, treatment, and management of offenders to reduce risk and improve public safety. In correctional psychology, the principles of psychology are applied for correctional purposes, and these on the treatment and management of the criminals or offenders and includes interventions for the inmates and offenders. The correctional psychologists employed in prisons not only assess and diagnose both psychological and other emotional problems of the prisoners, but they also treat and rehabilitate the prisoners when released from prison after their term is over, psychological effect of the prison conditions and environment on the offenders and so on. Correctional psychologists also play a role in assessment and evaluation of the offenders. Correctional psychologists working in prisons and correctional institutions like those for delinquents etc. use many methods and psychological techniques to counsel them with the final goal of rehabilitating them back into the society. It is thus important for correctional and forensic psychologists to help rehabilitate those prisoners, particularly persons kept in judicial custody until their case is complete in court, as well as those prisoners who are referred to as under trials, serving prison term for many years without any trial. The main goal of correctional psychology is the rehabilitation and reintegration of the offender. Reintegration here implies the process of returning a previously incarcerated offender to the community with the proper skills and support to be a productive member of society. And this objective can be achieved by having various intervention strategies for the offenders like educational opportunities, training programs, interventions related to mental health and substance use, skill enhancement programs and so on. Often correctional psychologists are also involved in crisis intervention as they work with offenders. Research as well is a part and parcel of the job of a correctional psychologist, as he/she could carry out research on varied topics like effectiveness of methods of incarceration, strategies for rehabilitation and reintegration of the offenders and so on. 10.3 Roles of forensic psychologist in the context of correctional psychology. Let us now look at the role of forensic psychologists in the context of correctional psychology. 10.3.1 Role of forensic psychologist in prisons. Prisons are where the convicted criminals are sent to, and they live in prison for the period of time assigned to them. Prison can be a form of punishment or means of removing the individual from the society for safety of others. It can be incapacitation of the offender, rehabilitation, and also denunciation to imply that the behavior as displayed by the offender will not be tolerated. Prison includes a social environment as various offenders as well as the guards interact with each other on day-to-day basis. The social climate of a correctional system like prison has three main dimensions according to Moose. Relationship-oriented, includes support, involvement and expression. Personal development, includes autonomy, practical orientation and personal problems orientation. System maintenance and change, includes order and organizations, program clarity and staff control. Prisons need to play an important role in rehabilitation of the offender, and thus the environment needs to be created in such a way that it facilitates positive behavior change. Often prisons are very crowded, humid, lack ventilation. Prisoners may also be deprived of good food and may not have good sanitation, toilet facilities and not enough water to bathe, etc. Many prisoners suffer from skin diseases and other related ailments. There is no adequate health facilities to tend to them. These prisoners more often than not live in fear. These negative environmental factors combined with complete separation of prisoners from their own families and friends, lead to mental health problems such as depression, frustration, anger, aggression and so on. Some prisoners do manifest psychotic symptoms, in which case they are locked up for longer periods. Thus, prisons do have higher percentage of mentally ill persons. Quite a few of them also have problems in impulse control and thus end up assaulting other prisoners and subsequently put in isolation for longer periods. There are also prisoners who suffer from delusions and hallucinations. Furthermore, prisoners, as pointed out above, may live in very poor environmental conditions that render them all the more susceptible to developing psychiatric disorders. Psychotic disorders, substance abuse and addiction are commonly found amongst the prisoners. The psychologists working in prisons help diagnose and treat these patients and put in their best efforts to rehabilitate them also. There are also prisoners who are first-timers and are in prison for the first time. These prisoners suffer from adjustment disorders. The prison population being very large and proportionately the number of psychiatric cases being high, many remain undiagnosed and untreated for mental disorders. While patients who have a propensity to develop psychiatric disorders become worse in prison settings, those who suffer from mental disorders deteriorate faster. On the other hand, those who suffer from psychiatric disorders have been found to have a tendency to commit more crimes than those who do not suffer from mental disorders. Thus, the role of forensic psychologists in prison is very challenging. They are involved in assessment of competency amongst prisoners to stand trial, and they also assess to what extent the prisoner concerned is responsible for the crime, etc. They also make assessment and determine to what extent the many defenses put up by the prisoner or the accused, such as being intoxicated and not knowing what he/she was doing, etc., are valid defense, and appraise the court regarding the same. Forensic psychologists, though, are highly involved in assessment. In a large number of cases they take prisoners for counseling and psychotherapy so as to treat them of mental disorders, as well as work a great deal with prisoners and even staff in reducing stress and anxiety. Forensic psychologists are proficient in prisoner profiling and they give expert evidence in the court. 10.3.2 Role of forensic psychologist in court / trials. Forensic psychologists bring psychology and behavioral research into the courtroom. They have a very important role in criminal justice, and they work with the judges, the lawyers, attorneys, police, city planners, school authorities, directors and officers in correctional institutions, military units and private sector organizations. Forensic psychologists are involved in both punishing criminals and preventing crime. Forensic psychology is a combination of law and psychology. These personnel are involved in research and investigation of various crimes and criminals. They try to find out why a person commits crime, what are his /her personality traits, what kinds of crime would a person commit, where and when and how to prevent the same. Based on a lot of accumulated data of large number of criminals and their profiles, forensic psychologists are able to appraise the police as well as the court regarding the profile of the criminals, where and how they may attack, etc. They also recommend many measures to the police and administration to prevent crimes from occurring. Thus, forensic psychologists are required in the court system, law enforcement agencies, correctional institutions and also in medical treatment facilities. They deal with psychological theories to legal problems of varied types, and study criminal justice in addition to clinical psychology. They work closely with the justice system. As mentioned earlier, they conduct screenings and assessments of prisoners. They diagnose psychological disorders among persons who are accused and who are defendants. Their duty is to examine the mental status of the accused and the defendant and tell the court if they can stand trial in terms of their mental status. Forensic psychologists testify in court on behalf of the accused and at times on behalf of the defendants. Where a defendant or accused is mentally ill, or where they need counseling or psychotherapy, forensic psychologists take them on therapy and gets them well and back in the court. If required, they may take up both individual and group therapy sessions to get them well. In some cases, if needed, family members may also be taken up for sessions. For long-term incarcerated prisoners who may have been out of touch with other human beings and normal social situations and interactional situations, halfway home and daycare facilities may also be offered so that the prisoners get used to other humans and learn to interact with them. These are a few of the rehabilitative measures undertaken by the forensic psychologists. As prison life is stressful for the incarcerated persons, it may lead to mental health problems which are attended to by the forensic psychologists. While doing so, forensic psychologists protect the rights of each of their clients who are referred to them. The roles performed by forensic psychologists thus are diverse, in the sense that from creating criminal profiles for law enforcement agencies, to understanding the behaviors of criminals in myriad ways in order to deal with each of their unique personality, to diagnosing why a criminal commits a crime, to also finding out who are more vulnerable to fall victims to a crime, and finally to find ways and means to reducing crime in society. Forensic psychologists are also responsible for assessing the mental stability of criminals who are standing trial. They inform the judges if the person standing for trial is in a mental balanced state to answer the court. They evaluate the accused and the criminals to ascertain if they are showing any signs of mental disorders. They provide where needed psychotherapeutic services to render the mentally ill person asymptomatic. In addition to the above significant roles, forensic psychologists also conduct child custody evaluations, visitation risk assessments, give testimonies in lawsuits, and finally handle custody cases and carry on work with family courts. Thus, forensic psychologists play important roles in both courts and during trials, mainly because they are very well trained and have acquired skills, viz. Judging the mental state of the criminals, provide to the courts additional evidence, providing the prisons with the type of treatment that the prisoners should get if mentally ill in some way, thereby helping the criminal justice system by submitting the many evidences needed, as well as provide materials and documents to the court, to render justice to the victims and the accused. Forensic psychologists possess valuable skills that can help in improving the criminal justice system. These include evaluation and reporting to the court the mental state of the accused or the victim referred by the court and presenting to the court more evidences that would help in fair judgment. In the first case wherein the forensic psychologist evaluates and assesses the mental state of the person concerned, the main focus is to ascertain if the individual understands why he/she is in the court. What crime had he/she committed and what is he/she accused of, and whether he/she knows what he/she did was correct and whether he/she can defend himself/herself. If the person's mental state is balanced and not disturbed, he/she would be able to stand the trial in the court. This is what the forensic psychologist ascertains using psychological tests and interviews and reports his/her findings to the court whether or not the individual can stand the trial in the court. In the second point where the forensic psychologist presents more evidences, is based on the many psychological investigations and assessments he/she does and is able to present such evidence which cannot be obtained by mere crime scene investigations by the police. To conclude, it may be stated that forensic psychology, which focuses on criminal behavior, helps the criminal justice system to render fair justice, by providing the judicial system with materials consisting of clinical assessments, many evidences that are based on psychological assessments, eyewitness testimonies that are valid and reliable, and finally providing the court with proficient and reliable treatment plan for the incarcerated persons who develop mental disorders while in jail, and those who suffer from one form of mental illness or the other. 10.3.3 Role of forensic psychologist in interrogation and confession. Interrogation as a subject matter has been dealt with in detail elsewhere in the Unit 9. Interrogation is generally carried out by the police in order to discover the truth about a crime. Quite often the interrogation is also aimed at making the person confess to the crime. In cases of confession, the person concerned would have even made false confessions in order to escape the police coercion. A confession, as is well known, increases the possibility of pronouncing guilty verdicts, especially in all the cases where the accused has been coerced to confess. In such cases the judge may even instruct the jurors to ignore the confession. It must be kept in mind that confessions are much more powerful than eyewitness testimony, especially in criminal trials. To overcome the pitfalls in judgment, where the judge finds the accused has been coerced to confess, the court may ask for assessment by forensic psychologist who may take up interrogation and find out the possibility of false confession. Since there are many factors that lead to false confessions, as for example, small uncomfortable room, soundproof space, with one-way mirror to record all observations in regard to the accused and the process of interrogation, and the situations as well as evidences both false and true being presented, the strong suggestions made to the accused, etc. would all make him/her falsely confess to a crime that he/she has not committed. It is thus important to understand confessions and their importance in the judgment and in the court of law. Social science research on wrongful convictions has demonstrated that there are 4 ways to prove a confession is false when it can be objectively established that the suspect confessed to a crime that did not happen. For example, the presumed murder victim is found alive, when it can be objectively established that the defendant could not have committed the crime because it would have been physically impossible to have done so. For example, he/she was in another location at the time of the crime. When the true perpetrator of a crime is identified and his guilt can be objectively established, or when scientific evidence conclusively establishes the confessor's innocence. 10.3.4 Role of forensic psychologist in death penalty, trials and appeals. Death penalty is the capital punishment that the Supreme Court pronounces as judgment. Before that, expert opinion is sought from professionals. Forensic psychologists usually present their opinions on matters such as competency to stand trial and insanity problem. They present violence risk assessments to the general population, and also indicate the presence of sexual predator to the public so that they remain on guard. In quite a few cases, forensic psychologists interview the defendant and his/her family and review all the documents and related matters so as to help the court. Despite all their efforts, at times wrong judgments could be given and innocent person is convicted or executed. Almost all these wrongly convicted cases also go through all the required and routine proceedings in the court of law, using therein the expert testimony and investigations and assessments of the accused as well as the eyewitnesses, and the victims. While it is imperative for the prosecutor to use the correct evidence for the argument in court, they seek professional advice from the psychologist but must make sure that the advice and statements given by the psychologist is absolutely beyond doubt. 10.3.5 Role of forensic psychologist with regard to sexual harassment and discrimination. Sexual harassment of women, whether home, on the street or in a workplace, has been quite common not only in India, but globally too in quite a few countries. While almost all governments around the world have tried to prevent as well as reduce such sexual harassment, in India considerable efforts by the government and passing of many legislations against such harassment have been done, and there has been some improvement in treatment of women as an equal without discrimination in terms of gender factor. It is well known that since industrialization, sexual harassment of women in industries has been a perennial issue and women had to put up with the same because of their economic and survival needs. In India, in the year 1997, the Supreme Court passed a landmark judgment wherein they put down in clear terms guidelines for the industries and other establishments to follow when there are complaints about harassment. It is to be mentioned and remembered that a safe workplace for a woman is her legal and fundamental right guaranteed by Articles 14 and 15 of the Indian Constitution, and sexual harassment constitutes a gross violation of women's right to equality and dignity. The laws in India provide women the needed protection from harassment, yet women are likely to experience intimidation, threats and abuse. Workplace sexual harassment creates an insecure as well as a hostile work environment, which deters women from working outside of her home. This adversely affects their social and economic growth. This problem of sexual harassment is also termed as problem of discrimination against women. It affects their safety, health and their fundamental rights, and it is highly offensive and makes the woman exposed to all kinds of vulgarity. This also undermines their rights to equal opportunity to work and earn. In the context of workplace, we can also discuss about workplace bullying. According to Einarsson et al., workplace bullying is defined as systematic negative treatment of an individual over an extended period of time in situations which he/she has difficulties to defend against. Workplace bullying is an important risk factor that affects the health of the person who is being bullied, reduces his/her work efficiency and makes the person concerned helpless, depressed and frustrated. It requires effective intervention from the organization so that this problem is prevented as well as reduced. Also, workplace bullying needs a change in the mindset of people who harass others. They do not understand the impact of such bullying on the victim, who suffers from all kinds of fears and apprehensions, feelings of pressure to do things they don't want to, getting the blame for the bullying, stating that the victim was responsible for having invited such sexual advances, etc. It is important to realize and accept that it is easy and convenient to blame the victim, though she is not in any way responsible. This means the blame has to shift from the victims onto the perpetrators for such harassment also. Many victimized employees, both male and female, hardly talk about their indignity for fear of losing their jobs or jeopardizing their future. This attitude in turn perpetuates bullying. Such people lose their confidence, suffer from anxiety and confusion even in regard to their own abilities. The only way to manage a bully in a workplace is to have enough evidences and facts, gathered meticulously regarding each incident of bullying, as much in detail as possible. If there had been witnesses, they should be requested for help and support. Since bullying affects both physical and mental health, bullying has to be eliminated. In a research conducted on how culture of civility affected the employees, and how male and female perceived bullying and how they defended themselves, the results showed that psychological bullying has the worst impact on both males and females, and incivility in the workplace is a very serious problem. In yet another research on bullying from psychological perspective, it was found that there was a tendency amongst male workers to invoke sex-based stereotypes. It was also noted that certain forms of sexual harassment was directed towards only some females and not others. Another finding was that where the organizational climate is tolerant of sexual harassment and workplace bullying, there are more cases of such harassment reported, and many women were found to be suffering from emotional and psychological problems. Social psychologists are of the view that sexual harassment is a joint product of situation and person variables. They also found that stimuli commonly faced in day-to-day situation sometimes trigger uncontrollable cognitive responses in some men that produce harassing behaviors. The social cognitive model explains sexual harassment as occurring in two-stage process. In the first stage, the belief is that sexual assault is harassment. But if the same exceeds the limit and the threshold of offensiveness, people perceive it as harassment and do not bother to consider the cognitive activity part of it. Furthermore, there is also an aspect of self-referencing. Each individual so harassed tries to analyze why he/she became the target, and as one analyses, they take into consideration race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation of the observer, the harasser, and the complainant, and see what all had led to such harassment. Depending who the person is and what cultural and other background he/she has, plus the social aptitude and the power that the harasser has, the analysis will also be highly influenced by those factors, and thus the accuracy of harassment judgments will also get affected. In addition, factors like responsibility, strength, confidence and being a bully also is associated with sexual harassment. Forensic psychologists help sexually harassed and bullied persons by psychological treatment interventions. Some of the mental health problems faced by such persons include depression, anxiety, PTSD, personality disruptions, attachment issues and even addictions. Not only these sexually abused persons suffer from psychological scars, but also suffer from long-term health problems. Some of the physical injuries could be, for instance, knife cuts, injuries, broken bones, pain without a cause, headaches, etc., which all cause extreme discomfort. Generally, people cope with their trauma in many ways. It is also known quite a large number of women and also men have survived sexual assault of varied types. Those who have survived can be given counseling and other psychological therapeutic help by forensic psychologists. Some of the therapies used include psychodynamic psychotherapy, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, EMDR, for the treatment of patients following sexual assault and abuse. In this context we can discuss about the 5-phase model of therapy. This therapy consists of the following phases: Phase 1, assessment and education; Phase 2, rapport and strengths; Phase 3, cognitive intervention; Phase 4, emotion-focused intervention; Phase 5, trauma narrative. The important aspects of this 5-phase treatment is: A. The effective assessment skills, especially the strengths and assets of the victim. B. The focusing on the detailed history of the victim and the complex trauma that has resulted in so many symptoms. C. Empowering and encouraging the victims to stand up and face the world and her own physical and mental conditions. D. The empathic strength-based approach and using both cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, and rational emotive behavior therapy, RET. Further, development and maintenance of trusting relationship between the victim and the therapist could bring about a positive change in the victim towards accepting his/her trauma and wanting to do something about it to overcome the same. Another helping technique is to make the victim verbalize and recount the assault event again and again so that the debilitating symptoms could be reduced which are due to post-traumatic stress. The therapists also teach the victims other skills such as anger management, assertiveness and communication. The focus is more on the current situation and how to solve the present problem rather than going into the past or into the future. The ability to solve the present problem provides the victim with confidence and strength to overcome many of the emotional upheaval he/she faces. There are thus many treatment modalities that are used by forensic psychologists in helping victims overcome their trauma. The choice of treatment intervention is based on the characteristics of the victim, the duration and severity of the symptoms, as well as the response to therapy. 10.3.6 Role of forensic psychologists in dealing with persons in conflict with law. In the last decade and more, there has been a tremendous increase in the area of forensic psychology. It is pertinent to note that American Psychological Association recognized forensic psychology as a specialty in 2001, and recommended recertification in 2008. Interestingly, over the years, the practice of forensic psychology has become quite different from that of the traditional psychological therapies, one reason being the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists that were developed and published in 1991. These specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists have also been getting revised, so as to benefit forensic practitioners and improve the quality of forensic psychological services to the beneficiaries. Forensic psychologists apply scientific, technical, and specialized knowledge of psychology to the law and help in legal, contractual, and administrative matters. The forensic psychologists thus provide expert advice to judicial, administrative, and educational systems including how to handle persons after the legal proceedings. They offer expert opinion about psychological issues to judicial, legislative or administrative bodies. They also serve as a trial consultant and offer expertise to attorneys, the courts, or others. They also undertake research studies, they collect information on various legal issues, and disseminate the same to the concerned personnel and groups. They also explain the practical implication of these research results. Forensic psychologists are also trained in treatment interventions such as psychotherapy etc., and they provide these services as required to the accused or the victim and as directed by the courts. However, it may be kept in mind that psychological testimony that is solely based on the provision of psychotherapy and not involving any legal matter or issue, will not be considered forensic practice. Even though forensic psychologists are dealing with persons coming in conflict with the law, they strive for accuracy, honesty and truthfulness and resist any partisan pressures that may lead to wrong conviction or judgment. By and large, their being impartial and fair helps the courts to rely on their statements, and forensic psychologists not only recognize the adversarial nature of the legal system but make sure that they weigh all information and statistics in an impartial manner. They also avoid conflict of interest and ensure public confidence and trust. Forensic psychologists recognize the importance of obtaining a fundamental and reasonable level of knowledge of legal and professional standards, laws, rules, and precedents. They also manage their professional conduct in a manner that does not threaten or impair the rights of affected individuals. Forensic psychologists recognize their own cultures, attitudes, values, beliefs, opinions, may affect adversely their ability to practice in a competent and impartial manner. Hence they take extra care to keep these in check while serving their clientele. Similarly, they also are aware of the adverse effect of age, gender, disabilities affect their effectiveness in serving people, and thus take undue care to ensure these do not come in the way of their providing service to the courts, or to people who need legal services. Forensic psychologists enter into explicit agreement with their clients in terms of the scope of their services, time frame, and remuneration for their services. If the client acts in a way that would make the forensic psychologist to violate any norm or legal or professional obligations, they would terminate the agreement with the client. Forensic psychologists keep updating their clients regarding the case, etc., and where necessary consult their clients and get feedback regarding the service being offered to them and what improvements do they consider to be effected, so that the psychologists could give satisfactory services to their clients. Though service offered by the forensic experts is for a certain period of time, the client and the psychologist may decide to end their relationship either because the problem is resolved or because the agreement has been violated in some ways. Forensic psychologists ensure confidentiality, privacy clauses, and privileged information to be also kept confidential by the client as well as self, and ensures there is no conflict of interest. They also recognize the potential conflicts that may arise between self and the client concerned, and if any conflict do arise, an effort is made to minimize any detrimental effect and if necessary may even limit their obligations consistent with professional responsibility as for their expertise in therapeutic /psychological interventions. When requested for the same they do provide, and if the client needs therapy which may require other than psychotherapy, the forensic psychologists may refer them to the concerned therapists for betterment of the client. Whenever a client, or an accused or a victim needs to be tested and investigated further in regard to their mental status or any other aspect related to the psycholegal issue, forensic psychologist explains the same to the client concerned, particularly what the test contains, how it would be administered and how their responses will be used and the possible conclusions they may arrive at, etc. They make sure that the confidentiality of the entire process is explained to the client in advance, and also informing the client to whom these results will be disclosed and the permission of the client to report the results to the concerned authorities. These in turn help to make sure of the cooperation of the client. In certain cases the client may refuse to give his consent to the process of testing or diagnosing or treatment recommended, etc., in which case the forensic psychologist puts in extra effort to explain to the client the need for the testing, etc., and persuades the client to give his /her consent for the entire process. While doing so, the forensic psychologist also ensures that the rights and welfare of his /her client are well protected. If and when forensic psychologists face any conflict with the legal authorities, or the client or even the public, they make sure the conflict is resolved by following the standard guidelines and the court directives provided to them. When there arises any conflict with the public or otherwise in regard to any case referred to them, forensic psychologists remain consistent with legal and ethical requirements, and make sure that there is no distortion of any information obtained by them in regard to the case concerned. They provide reports and other statements, evidence and testimonies to the courts and other authorities, in as fair and justified manner as possible. It is important to keep in mind that forensic psychologists very clearly indicate what all they had observed, and how and what they inferred from the information and data they had gathered, and why and how they had arrived at a certain conclusion. They link these with the legal issues and facts of the case. In addition, they also clearly show the various sources from where they obtained the needed information. All these measures and steps ensure that forensic psychologists are able to effectively deal with varied types of persons who are in conflict with the law. 10.4 Let us sum up. In the present unit, we mainly discussed about correctional psychology. Correctional psychology is one of the important branches or subfields of psychology is correctional psychology. In this, basic psychological principles and techniques are applied to help the justice system to classify the various mental health problems of prisoners, treatment of the illnesses, and managing the incarcerated and the accused individuals in such a manner that the risk of their repeating the crime gets reduced and thereby improve the safety and security of the general public. The unit mainly focused on the role of forensic psychologist in prisons, court/trials, interrogation, confession, and the role of forensic psychologist in death penalty, trials and appeals, sexual harassment and discrimination, and dealing with persons in conflict with law.